Hi, I'm Al Mackay. What I'm going to be doing here is basically just going through more of the theory of how to get particle flow to get an object to transform from one object to another. And this is something you might have seen with like thinking particles, Blurp, which again is like really primitive and straightforward, but that method, or with Sandblaster and Particle Studio, a lot of the older plugins that allowed you to have like a source object and a target object, and have one object turn into particles and do whatever it needs to do and then reassemble into another. And that kind of effect is very interesting to do. However, with Particle Flow and Max, it hasn't exactly been the most straightforward feature. However, with a little bit of scripting, not much at all, it is actually quite easy to do. And I might have covered this to an extent, or to a very vague extent, in the past, but this is something that I'm just going to get more into the rough theory of, and then from there you can pretty much use it to create some cool effects. And you see this kind of stuff a little bit with like things like The Mummy and other Hollywood films that have like a character who might turn into particles and whisper around the room, and then like turn into something else or do whatever. And this is just a way to do that kind of thing. So to begin, I guess we're just going to need to create, and I will go through this kind of quickly, but just like a standard max object and then a target object. And I might just up the segments a little bit so we've got a few more polys to work with here. Okay, and the next thing I need to do is bring up my particle flow window. I'm just going to display depot and getting rid of depot and description. I'm just going to work with my whole view here. The first thing I need to do is just create a flow, and then a birth event, and lastly a position object. You might notice I've got a few additional things here. These are just using the particle flow tools box sets. So if you don't have them, you might see them, but don't worry, we're not using any of that stuff, at least not right now. Okay, so the first thing I need to do, I'm just going to set my particles to all spawn at frame 0. And we'll just start off with like 2,000 particles. That will be a good starting point. Now, this is going to sound a little bit backwards, but rather than having our particles spawn from the sphere and turn to the teapot, we actually want the particles to spawn on the target first. And I'll explain why in a second, but we'll just call this event particles target pos for target position. And so once we've done that, I was going to my position object and select add and select my teapot. And now we can see our particles are spawning over our teapot object. I might just select my PF source and set the viewport percent to 100%, just so I can see all of my particles in the view. Now, the reason we're doing this is because we need to actually get the position of where the particles need to go before we even do anything else. So initially we're telling it to emit onto the target object, and then we're just going to create a script operator. And I was going to rename this to script op colon, and I was going to call it get target pos. If I click on edit script, just resize my window, I can get rid of pretty much everything in here. Okay, so I've just gotten rid of a lot of the stuff. I'm just going to change this to use vector equals true, then p_cont.use position equals true. So what I'm trying to do is I'm going to be enabling the vector channel and the position channel. And then there's this variable that's left over from before, just saying count equals num particles. So it's just saying I can grab the amount of particles as a variable called count. So that way for I in 1, 2 count do, it'll loop through however many particles, 2,000 particles or 5 billion particles, it'll loop through every single one of those. So it's just a standard for loop, and we're just saying the particle index each time I is going to be the number we're up to, and I'm just going to say pcont dot, I guess, particle vector equals pcont dot particle position, and all it's doing is it's going to get the position of my particle and store it into the vector channel. So the vector channel is something that we're storing this information into, and then later on we'll be grabbing it. So each and every particle, it'll later read the vector channel like an array, and it'll grab the position of where it needs to go on the teapot. So fingers crossed that works. Yes, it does. Okay, great. And so that was really simple. Like, all we've done is grab the position of where the particles need to go. And if we wanted to, just so we could spell it out, we could say, like, I think print pcont.particle vector. And as string. And this just printed out every single one of our particles position, all 2,000 of them. So we don't need that, but if we just want to be able to see them and see that it's working. Alright, so that was very simple. All we've done is birthed 2,000 particles onto this teapot, and we've stored the position of each and every one of these particles into the vector channel. Okay, so we're on frame 0, and rather than have an age or anything, or do it as a roll-up before frame 0, we're just going to do send out. So as soon as it does this, still in frame 0, the particles are going to go into a new event. So as soon as I connect this, it'll turn into ticks. Why? Because it automatically goes into this event once it does this operation. So it's done that. Now we're going to say particles source pos, and this is just going to say we're now going to tell the particles to go to their source position. So again, another position object, and we select the sphere. And so you can't see it, but right now at the very beginning, what's going to happen is they're going to birth onto this object, store their position, and then go into the next event, which is telling it to sit on the sphere. So we don't actually get to see the particles on the teapot at all. They just appear on the sphere. But we actually have the target position stored in the vector channel. So what we can do now is, if we wanted, choose find target. And we just did that by append test find target. And rather than an icon, which will tell the particles to go over to this icon here, we actually want to say mesh object and select the teapot here. And what's going to happen is they're going to suck in and zoom right past. The next thing we want to do, because once they get there, we can actually test it true. So we're going to say speed operator, and we're just going to set the speed to 0. So what happens is when we connect this, if they come near it, they'll stop. Okay, so that was pretty nifty, and it does what it needs to do. But then we could say like ease in, so they actually, I might need to make that happen a bit better. So they're appearing on the object where they need to be. Only problem, and you can't really see it here, but they're actually like randomly appearing on the object, which we don't want. Like they're randomly going somewhere. So we're actually going to, and this is the important part, we're going to go down to point in the find target and go to by script vector. And what it's going to do is each and every one of these particles has a target position on the teapot. And as you can see, they break up and they position themselves where they need to go. One thing I just remembered, which is kind of handy, is we can go to icon and they'll go to their target. This is actually a bug that I worked out with Bobo, and I keep forgetting, but you know, we're using the script vector, which tells the particles to go to where they need to go. Thing is, we can actually say mesh object, and it'll offset it based on the position of the object. And this doesn't actually need to be a teapot. We could have another object over here and select that object, and it would get the source position of these particles but form it over near that object. So the good thing about that is it allows us to then offset our particles appearance to the pivot. So this is kind of handy, and it might be going a little bit too quickly, but this just allows us to use a mesh object to get our particles to form the object we need it to target to, but in a separate position. So you can treat it like a transform and offset, but right now we don't need to really worry about that, so we'll just choose icon. And this means the particles will form exactly where they need to on the next object. Okay, so that was very simple. So now we have particles forming from one object to another. And all, again, just recapping, is we're birthing the particles on the target, the teapot, getting and storing the position into the vector channel, telling it to go to the next event, which positions it on the sphere. Then in a find target, we're just saying that the find target needs to, or the particles need to find a position stored in the vector channel. So particle 1 will go to the stored vector channel for particle 1, and so on and so forth. And when it gets there and tests true, it goes into this event, which tells it to stop. We could actually say to, when it gets to this event, shoot upwards or downwards. But of course we don't really want to do that. But again, it's, you know, an option if we needed to. Okay, so that right there is the end of the tutorial in terms of how to get one object to turn to another. And again, if you're worrying about shape or anything, like you could use boxes and tetrahedrons, just make it really dense amounts of particles, and it might be slow to work with, but it still will do the trick. And then you just do a bit of messing about in comp. Or you could use lots of little cubes that are really solid, or however you want to go about it. So now we've done that, let's just make this a little bit more interesting. Before we do any of this find target business, let's mess about a little bit. Let's go to space warps, deflectors, and again just use a spherical deflector, just like in that dispersion tutorial. And for the first 50 frames, we'll have this moving in over the particles. And I could probably even move it a little bit more over, so that way we just get the deflector moving in. Next, we do a collision, and we select a collision test, and we select the deflector. And lastly, so it doesn't actually deflect, we make it continue. Okay, so now we've just got the particles colliding, and we want that to test into a new event, just to see that it's working. And if I'm going too quickly here, then try the dispersion tutorial I did a couple of years ago that's on the same website you should be viewing this from. That will go through this a lot more in depth. But here we go, we have the deflector moving in, touching these particles, telling them to go to the new event, particles relief, I guess. And this will tell the particles to, you know, go into the new event. Here I'm actually going to use another find target, but I'm going to use icon again, but I'm going to use random. And so that means they're actually going to go to this icon here. I'll make the color a little bit easier to see, but all they're doing now is they're actually aiming for this icon wherever it goes. Or actually, sorry, that's the wrong one. They're going towards this icon here. So this means that we could actually play around a little bit and make this a bit more interesting. We'll make the speed of it 150 with a little bit ease in, and then once it finds this find target, it'll go to the next event, which is this particles go to source. And so just before we even play it, we've got the particles going to a collision which goes to the new event. And this is why I said before, like, you know, stop the tutorial there if you want to go through it, but now we're getting a little bit more tricky. So once the collision goes into this event, it leaves to find this target. Once it gets there, it goes to the next target, which is the teapot. And that means it's going to come in and form our teapot here. Okay. So I might just get this teapot and move it away a little bit. Just that way we've got a little bit of distance here. So we've got the particles moving from one to the next. Next thing I want to do is just go to my source, like the one that grabs the vector channel, set the accel limit to 400. I'm just guessing this, yeah, that'll give it a little bit of lag. It won't change the speed, but it'll tell the, it'll give it less response, so it takes a little bit of time to redirect itself to the new target, which kind of works, but then I guess it goes for the teapot and misses and comes back in, which isn't that great. But we'll get rid of the ease in. And yeah, okay, well, let's try playing with these a little bit. I'm just experimenting right this very second, so yeah, that'll do. Alright, so I've just set the find target on both to be accel limit of 500. I'll set on the find targets going to the icon. I'll rename this to like FT for find target icon to make that a little bit easier to understand. FT teapot. So now we know which ones they're going for. FT icon. We'll go for 25%. Give it about 10% variation. One thing I might do is say is less than and put 2 or 3. This means that it doesn't necessarily need to go exactly to that point. It'll go into that kind of circumference or that area. So that means it will start the turn true earlier. And I could set this a little bit higher to make it more extreme. Or it might be the other way around. Okay, yeah, so this is setting it more extreme, so it's only getting close, and then it begins to go to the next event. So we don't need to specifically go to this icon. We could say just come close and then arc around. And we can set the ease in and all that stuff. And what we're getting is this nice little, you know, arcing around. Next, to make it even more cool, I might just add in a wind space warp. And I guess most people are probably pretty familiar with the kind of like rough settings I use. And again, like all the turbulence settings I always use are pretty much based on like if I were to use the script listener down here, type in like a sphere, it creates a default sphere. And like I'm basing my scale every time to be the same scale. And that's like the real advantage here. Like if I build everything to a set scale, then all the effects I do are always going to be the same settings that, well, you know, they'll all be the same scale, which means I don't need to fish around for new settings. I know a lot of artists kind of like mess about with the frequency and just play to kind of guess what the right settings are, but because I'm always using the right scale, For something like this, I can go, okay, well, I guess I need to change this by 25% downward to make it a little bit more curvature in the arcing of of the octaves. Um, you know, it just allows me to familiarize myself with what I'm working with. And if something is 10 times smaller, then you get the idea. I'd have 10 times smaller values based on that set unit scale that I'm working with. Um, so that means that I pretty much know the kind of rough settings I want to work with here. So this will be a nice kind of arc. So, alright, all I've done is I've created a wind space warp. And I'm going to create that as a force. And I want to make sure it's below the find target. And this means that I can just play with this a little bit. One thing I might do now is just change all of my things to dots, so I can just see them a little bit better, because now I'm getting some more finer motion. I want to be able to see kind of what they're doing. And I guess I'm aiming this towards more advanced users, so I'm not going through all the settings as much. But as you can see, I'm starting to create these turbulence kind of things. I can see it's a little bit of a jelly motion, so I've just put the frequency down. I had it at 2, and I guess because it's fighting between the find target and the force, or the wind space warp, it gives it this kind of push-pull kind of feel, which I don't really like. So I'm going to put down like 0.5, which will give it a bit more of a free kind of motion. Now here I might actually put the particle count up to 2000, and I'm going to turn off real time so we can kind of still play back, and we can see the kind of cool motion we're getting here. And again, I might just copy by holding down shift that in, so that way it gets that motion, but it still comes in on the next event as well. I might actually though just set this to be 500% influence, because it's needing to be a bit more specific with where it's going. Alright, so that's kind of working. I'll go back to my find target teapot and set the accel limit to 1000. And I'll set my speed to like 150 with 10% variation. And again, I'm just kind of guessing these settings, but this just means it's going to move slower, but it's going to have more direction, which means that we're getting this very specific kind of turn, which I don't really like, but I'll have to work with. I guess the slower the motion, though, the less response we need to. So maybe because I half the speed, we don't need it as much. So again, like I said, I'm playing, but I might just copy my wind, get the old one, get rid of it in this new event, and I might make this a lot more stronger. So I've added in wind space warp 2, and I might just make this a bit more stronger, a bit less frequency, and a bit more scale, so it's just going to be a lot bigger. In fact, what I might do is a bit more frequency. Anyway, you get the idea about what I'm doing here. It's essentially I'm just kind of giving it this nice kind of motion where it pushes and pulls through to come in and form this teapot. And again, I can do the same thing here if I'd like. I can set the is less than value for the find target teapot, which means it doesn't need to go to that specific point, but roughly around the same area. So I can do stuff like that if I want to. And I actually put the wind above the find target teapot, so they're not fighting as much. It ends up giving the same direction after all of it. And yeah, so I'm just again playing a little bit, but I'll set the speed up and the response up. And hopefully this is all we need. I'm just going to go in now and hide my teapot and sphere. In fact, I'm going to hide all this stuff except my particle system. And we can see we've got the particles going from one point to another. which it eventually forms the next object. And lastly, I might just rotate my teapot, so don't mind that. Alright. Easy. So again, in a nutshell, that's just a very cool and easy way to get one object to turn to another. And again, with that, I know I've kind of gone the hard route, but it's just purely showing a way to get the kind of stuff you want. Another way, rather than using a find target, I'll just quickly do is I might even do like an age test and plug that in. Set to event age. And finally, I'm just going to unhide my wind. I know I'm going through this fast, but again, it's pretty basic stuff. I just unhid my wind. I made it an age test. It's still using the same wind, but it's telling it to shoot upward. I might want it that extreme, so point it to like 0.2. But this way, we have it like shooting upward for a certain amount of frames, and then it's going to go to the next event and want to come inward. So now it's just a matter of like toning down the settings. I could also use drag if I'd like. So we'll try that. So it's shooting upward and then it's moving into the next system. And I could even turn off the age variation and tone down the next wind. Anyway, in a nutshell, that's just a couple of different ways to do that kind of effect. And it's very simple. And like I said before, you can use any kind of shape you want. You could camera project facing particles or something onto this particle system, so that way you have like the original object, and then do like a blend over time based on particle age. That could work out quite well. I won't build the shader, but just let's say if you had like a blend material and it goes from like one camera projected material to like a green, and then you just had like a particle age to blend from one to the other, and that way over time it would go from being the original to the source. And yeah, so that's it. Have a play, see what you can come up with.